as football, soccer, and other sports get rolling, keeping the students safe and the high temperatures Brendan is talking about is top of mind for many parents and coaches.
And ABC 10's Candace Red explains how some schools decide how hot is too hot when it comes to practice.
High schools are protecting student athletes from the heat. We're talking about all sports here. And of course, football, soccer, baseball, and more. The California Interscholastic Federation, also called the CIF, is the governing body for high school sports. They're implementing new rules and procedures this year concerning extreme heat. Now, schools statewide must use a wet bulb globe temperature device.
And what it does is it gives you a reading, and it gives you a wet bulb reading, not a dry temperature reading. And what that wet bulb reading does is it incorporates the air temperature, but also sun angle, solar radiation, humidity, as well as wind speed to really look at all the environmental factors.
Now, if it's too hot outside, practices or games will be delayed or canceled until it's cooler. It's also based on a color-coded chart, with the color black being the danger zone.
This is the first time it's been mandated in the state where there are certain levels on the wet bulb, and schools must follow those color codes, and those color codes tell you what you can do in regards to practice, in regards to time duration, equipment that can be used, and other parameters within.
The policy states schools must modify practice times based on the weather. That means scheduling outdoor practice during cooler times, like early morning or late in the evening. Now, in the past, before this policy was implemented, schools and districts kind of did their own thing and had their own rules and regulations when it came to protecting student athletes from the heat. Now, with this new policy, it's across the board for all schools to follow. In Sacramento, Candace Red, ABC 10.
Hello, I'm meteorologist Rob Carlmark.
And meteorologist Brendan Minchef.
And we are here to both explain this term wet bulb and wet bulb global temperature, because to be honest with you, even as meteorologists, we don't usually go into talking about this, but lately, because of the different rules for sports and safety of students, this is something that I think that you should know more about.
Yeah, it's kind of unique. Again, not something you hear us talk about on a weathercast, but especially if you have kiddos that are playing sports in the afternoon, this may be something that you're going to hear a lot more of.
So here's the idea. We're always trying to replicate how the weather impacts us as humans and what becomes safe or not. One of the ways that humans tend to stay cool in hot weather is by sweating, because when you evaporate water, sweat, it is a cooling process. So to replicate this, there's an instrument called a sling psychrometer. Again, you usually almost always see this in a textbook, or maybe one time in class. I saw it one time. Maybe you did too.
Yeah, if you've taken an intro to meteorology, you did the thing where you swing it around. Yep.
So what you do is you have your normal thermometer right here, and then you have another one that you have a wet cloth on the outside. As you spin it around, the water on that cloth evaporates. It cools down the other thermometer, and then you can see if you evaporate the water on the cloth, how much would you be able to cool down? It's a measurement of our ability to cool our bodies down.
Yeah, basically it's simulating sweating and the amount that you could cool off, right? But it's literally measured with a wet bulb, which is why it's called a wet bulb temperature.
Okay, so over time, this has evolved because there's other factors that are played into this. Now it's called the wet bulb global temperature. Now this factors in, of course, temperature, which we all know, humidity, which is a massive factor. That's also included in the heat index. Brendan will talk about that in a second.
Yep.
But it also includes wind speed, sun angle, and cloud cover.
Yeah, and the difference here between heat index, which we are more familiar with, this is what we might refer to as the feels like temperature, how hot it is outside, right? Not the air temperature, but what it kind of feels like to us. The difference is the wet bulb globe temperature takes all of these into account, and the heat index only takes in the air temperature and humidity in shady areas, not in the sunlight. So it is different, and the wet bulb globe temperature is supposed to kind of give a more realistic temperature for how effectively our bodies can cool down.
So there are some pitfalls with this, but we'll get into that in a second. So we want to show you how this is now incorporated into school sports. Now, CIF, which is basically the governing body of scholastic sports in California, is going to incorporate this. In fact, it's now mandatory to have this as a factor as you plan your practices and what you can or can't do, or even canceling that according to what the wet bulb global temperature is. The first thing that you do is the people in charge of athletics will put in their school zone, and try and figure out exactly where this matches up, because it's different for the area. Most places only have one zone. California, of course, has all three.
Yeah, and you can kind of see that here, like a lot of the Central Valleys, the inland deserts, that would be Zone 3. And then you've got some other areas like the High Sierra and kind of the transition areas between more coastal weather and valley weather. That's like a Zone 2. And then right along the coast is Zone 1. And like you said, they all have different criteria for what wet bulb globe temperature it has to be in order for them to start canceling or, shortening the length of sports practices.
So we'll bring this closer to home. Most people watching this will be in Zone 3, which is basically the Central Valley. So without getting into the weeds, because this would take up way too much of your time, there is basically one benchmark that I think is the most important, and that is, what is the wet bulb global temperature that it would take to cancel practices or games? And in Zone 3, that key number is anything greater than 92.1 degrees. Not air temperature, but again, it's that wet bulb global temperature that takes all 5 of those factors and then spits out this temperature. Once you get to that, the practices and games in Zone 3 would be canceled according to the CIF guidelines.
Yes, and for other areas like parts of Southern California, a little closer to the coast, Bay Area, they'd be in Zone 1, and so that temperature is a little bit lower, but again, it's all dependent on your air temperature, how high the sun is in the sky, the sun angle, the wind speed. So again, it's meant to be kind of this all-encompassing number, but it can be a little bit confusing just because there's so many factors into it.
Exactly. Now you're probably thinking, okay, I've heard all about it.
Yeah.
What does that mean to me? For example, what about today? Now this is recorded on Thursday, but I think this is important. The wet bulb global temperature forecast for today for this area, Zone 3 in Sacramento, for an example, at 4 p.m., it ends up being 85 degrees. Remember, the cutoff is 92 degrees. Now, we all know it's a hot day. The air temperature is going to be 104 degrees. The other factors like humidity and all that is also factored in, but the end result is 85 degrees, which on that scale would mean there's some precautions that coaches can take according to what they're seeing on the field, but not much more than that, even though it's 104 degrees.
Right. And so because we don't really see a lot of humidity here in Northern California, especially, the wet bulb globe temperature doesn't always change that much. In fact, a lot of times we are somewhere between the low 80s to the mid 80s, even on these really hot days. And so an extreme example would be if we took, say, the record high for today, which is 113 degrees, and then you added 25% relative humidity to that, the wet bulb globe temperature would only be 91 degrees, which, while there are more extreme restrictions, is not a cancellation of games or practices.
Exactly, according to the CIF guidelines,
That's
which
right.
I think is interesting. You know, it may be unique to Northern California, but I got to be honest with you. Imagine the hottest day you can really get around here, at the same time the most humid day you're going to get around here, and even then, according to the guidelines, they would not have to mandatory cancel those games or practices.
And you could even make a completely unrealistic scenario, too, where we have a high temperature of 116 or 117, right? The all-time record high in Sacramento. But then you add in a day with like 70% relative humidity. Again, a scenario that would not happen. We just don't see that kind of humidity here. And the wet bulb globe temperature would still not be 92 degrees.
Yeah, we've been playing with the numbers in the background just to see how we could tip the scales.
Yep.
It is really difficult, if not impossible, to do that. Now, going forward here, we have a couple more examples here to share with you.
Yeah, I think a more, I don't know, maybe to Northern California specifically, a better way to really measure how hot it is the heat index, right? What does it feel like out there? So today, with a forecast high of 104 degrees, the heat index at 4 o'clock would be 101 degrees. And that makes sense because it's a dry heat, and we say this kind of jokingly, but here in the West, it really is a dry heat. There's not a lot of humidity. So in fact, a lot of times your heat index, how hot it feels outside, will be a little bit lower, not a lot, but just a couple degrees lower than your actual air temperature. Now, in that same extreme example we talked about just a minute ago, where you take something like 25% relative humidity and an outside air temperature of like 106 or so, this is what your heat index would be, 119.
So what's interesting to us, at least, is that heat index is something that we use on TV, online. It's something you may be familiar with as well. Any reasonable coach or athlete or parent would see a heat index of 119 degrees and practices would not be happening. However, using the CIF guidelines, it could actually happen according to the guidelines. So this is something that will be, of course, tested and talked about over time. Our only observation on this is that a wet bulb global temperature, at least in many portions in California, doesn't always equate to how the players would feel out there on the field.
Yeah, I think to summarize, it's a little bit like book smart versus street smart, right? You see 119, and obviously practice isn't going to happen, even though the book says it could.
Now, we all know a little bit more about wet bulb temperatures, wet bulb global temperatures, heat index, of course. The bottom line is this. It is hot out there.
Yep.
Take it easy. Practice safety. Observe yourself and others, and we can get through these heat
And
waves.
drink plenty of water.